DC's got some great museums, but none where you can live out your wildest rock star dreams. Cleveland's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is where legends come alive. You can even jam out with their house band in their interactive musical experience, The Garage. And don't miss their incredible new SNL exhibit, featuring Will Ferrell's famous cowbell and the complete archive of every SNL musical performance ever aired. Check out the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame to learn more about the music that connects us all. Find more info at rockhall.com/exhibitions/SNL-50-years-music.
Today on CityCast DC, the federal workforce may be in trouble, but DC's sports economy is poised to roar, or at least that's the way Mayor Muriel Bowser and her team are saying it. But what does the city's famous pivot to sports even mean? We sat down with two Washington Post reporters who have been covering the mayor's efforts to build a new stadium. Meagan Flynn, who covers City Hall, and Sam Fortier, who writes for the sports section. Today is Monday, July 14th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. Hey, Megan.
Hey, Mike.
Hey, Sam.
Hey, Michael.
So you guys, Mayor Bowser, she keeps talking about DC being a new sports capital. It's like a big push, and they keep using this phrase. Is that actually a thing, sports capital? I mean, it sounds to me like all they're talking about is a city with 4 or 5 major sports teams who play in the city, and there's a lot of other places that do that too.
Well, I think it's a great marketing term, and Mayor Bowser started using it a while back, clearly to ramp up excitement or market DC as a place for a sports economy. She's used it, in talking about Capital One Arena, of course, RFK, and it's really, been in pursuit of getting all of the professional sports teams to both stay here or to come back here.
Is she implying by saying sports capital that like people from elsewhere will fly to Washington, D.C. in order to watch our sports? Because I don't think that's going to happen.
I don't know that there's what she's implying at all, other than truly just trying to attract people through a marketing hype, or just fans of the sports teams, which, may not need to fly on planes, but just come in from Maryland or Virginia or the region.
The one thing I will say about that is that this is the first World Cup coming up in which the capital city will not host any games. So I do think, while she's probably not necessarily thinking about that, when I think sports capital, I think, for the biggest events in the world, like DC was going to have to combine its bid with Baltimore, which I don't think was attractive to DC. And I will say, Michael, that there's only a handful of cities, I think 3 or 4, including Denver and Detroit, that have all 4 major sports teams in the jurisdiction that they represent. So it is funny. I think it's mostly a marketing tool, like Megan said, but there are a couple data points I feel like that maybe could make it a little more concrete.
That makes a lot of sense. And as I understand it, the World Cup, when they picked the destinations a few years ago, thought Washington's big stadium, FedEx Field at the time, it was not good enough.
Yeah, I mean, it is one of the worst stadiums in professional sports. I have been to almost all of them in the NFL. It's by far the worst, from the press box to the infrastructure. There was the railing collapsed and almost hit the Eagles quarterback a couple years ago, the sewage leak, things like that. It's just not capable of holding global sports events. Whether the taxpayers should pay what the mayor is proposing they pay, I think is a totally different debate. Not for me to weigh in on, but I do understand the desire to have a more upgraded stadium for that team.
So before we get into that debate, why do they need to do this marketing anyway? I mean, the sports capital, that seems fine, but I guess this is a marketing necessitated by the fact that so many other parts of the Washington economy, because of what's happening with the federal government, look really scary and risky right now.
That's right. I mean, there's really been a big push by the DC government to try to market different industries as attractive, including technology. Hospitality has always been a big one. And then, universities and healthcare as well. But the sports economy over the last couple years has really been one that Mayor Bowser has leaned in on. And she has specifically said that it is in part because we have to replace economic activity that the district's expected to lose from what has traditionally been its backbone, which is the federal government, due to the Trump job cuts. Plenty of people can have debates on what those industries should be that the district tries to pursue or invest in, but the mayor has certainly decided that sports is a big one.
So this so-called pivot to sports has, as best I can tell, two parts. One is these upgrades at Capital One Arena in Chinatown. What are they supposed to look like?
Yeah, that's in the bowl of the stadium infrastructure upgrades. There's a lot of things like in the ceiling, they can't hang what modern musical acts want. They've talked about adding a glassy facade and making parts of Capital One Arena accessible, 365 days a year, not just on game days. So that renovation, it's not going to be as ambitious as they'd like. They wanted to restructure the bowl. A lot of modern stadiums put more seats in the premium seating where you can charge more and they take away the nosebleeds. Right now, Capital One Arena is the opposite of that. They're not going to do that, but they're going to really upgrade the bones of the arena.
So a year ago, when this was sort of front page news, no one was talking about sports capital. They were talking about this as like a city crisis, that the planned departure of the Capitals and the Wizards was seen as sort of a last one out of downtown, turn off the lights thing. Now it's being talked about as sports, but at the time, the rationale was just keep downtown alive. Is that right?
Absolutely. Given the mayor has talked about DC as the quote unquote sports capital for so long, when Leonsis threatened to move those teams, it was like a 180. It was like, rather than the sports capital, the total opposite of that. You end up possibly losing two teams when she was trying to attract and retain all of them. Since then, to see, both the Capital One Arena and the deal with the Commanders come to fruition, that has been expected to be for both downtown, definitely part of the downtown revitalization agenda. But now with RFK, depending on whether lawmakers will approve it, part of like the overall vision for economic growth when the times are a bit tougher than they were even a few years ago when it was already seen as a crisis.
How much is the city on the hook for the Capital One Arena renovations?
$515 million.
Okay, so that's a lot less than the second piece of the pivot to sports, which is the return of a stadium on the current site of RFK Stadium. For people who haven't been following this, what are the basics of the deal?
Well, for the public investment, it's overall about $3.7 billion. On the public investment side of this, it's going to be over $1 billion. For the stadium construction itself, DC is expected to pitch in $500 million for some of the infrastructure related to that. But then additionally, you have things like parking garages that DC is going to be funding, other infrastructure like utilities, that's also going to be an additional $200 million, studying potential metro enhancements, public transportation enhancements that right now it's just a study, but could ultimately be another investment. There's going to be recreation and trail enhancements. So a lot of different buckets where DC is pitching in. Ultimately, what will be more than $1 billion.
Your paper reported that 55% of DC residents think it's okay to spend tax dollars on this project. Up to now, people had been thinking that the local politics of this might be tricky. What's your sense, just from talking to people? Are they feeling pretty confident that they'll be able to actually get this done?
On the DC Council?
In the DC Council, yes.
Yeah, I think that right now, there's some people on the council who are, very much opposed to using public funds for a stadium development. Mendelson, Brianne Nadeau came out pretty hard. But then, there's some others who are, I don't support the deal right now, unless I see a few other types of changes, whether that's more community benefits. There's usually like community benefits agreements where the community might be able to get additional needs or wants negotiated into the deal. For others, it's just a matter of the price tag itself. Like they don't want to see perhaps any money that's even related to the actual stadium. or they just don't want to see quite that big of a price tag. So I think we're going to see quite a bit of back and forth on the DC Council about both the terms of the deal, such as the arrangement with the Commanders as master developer, some of the other development perks that the Commanders are going to have, and also just the ultimate price tag of the taxpayer investment.
Sam, you cover the franchise. How confident are they feeling?
They feel pretty good, in part because of the numbers that you mentioned earlier. This is pretty popular among Washington area residents, among DC residents, among residents around the development and Commanders fans. Obviously, there's some significant and vocal opponents as well, but I think they're feeling pretty good about their ability to get this done. I think the team would point out they had 4 council members who showed up to that initial announcement of the deal, and they really feel like they have the public mandate to return the team to what they would call, the spiritual home of the franchise. I think for the team, this is not just about building a building. It's about erasing the 2.5 decades of scandal-plagued darkness under the ownership of Dan Snyder and coming back to where they won 3 Super Bowls and the stadium shook and they were the most valuable sports franchise in the world. So I think they're pretty optimistic and they're really driven to get it done.
Got CityCast set to auto-download? Now you're cooking with gas. Wait, cooking with gas is so last century. Not only is an all-electric home cleaner and healthier, but it can save energy and money too. Thanks to the DC SEU, or the DC Sustainable Energy Utility, it's easier and more affordable than ever to electrify. As in, any district resident can get up to $15,000 off upgrades. Income qualified folks, they can upgrade at no cost. Seriously. And the DC SEU has rebates for the good stuff: heat pumps that warm and cool efficiently, induction stoves that boil water faster than Donna Summer can say, well, hot stuff. Their team can help you update your electric panel, delivering the upgrades that make adding new appliances possible. But hey, the funding won't last. Visit dcseu.com/electric and bust a move on energy-efficient home electrification today.
Join the Library of Congress on July 24th for Ask the Ethicist, a live session with Kwame Anthony Appiah, 2024 recipient of the Kluge Prize and resident New York Times ethics columnist, who helps readers sort through life's sticky situations and moral dilemmas, from crypto and AI to lawn chemicals, pet names, using sick leave to slack off, and yes, politics. The ethicist seems to have heard it all. In this special interactive event, explore real-world moral dilemmas and cast your vote on what you would do. Then, hear how one of today's most influential public philosophers thinks through the same questions. Thoughtful and engaging, the library invites you to reflect on everyday ethical questions in a way that's personal, relevant, and fun. That's Ask the Ethicist on July 24th at the Library of Congress. Get free tickets at loc.gov/live.
This $1 billion that comes from city money, that's not just that like Muriel Bowser will sit down and write a check for $1 billion. Meagan, you watch the budget. As I understand it, this is going to involve bonds. This is going to be stuff that the city is paying for like 30 years. How exactly does that work? And how is that going to affect the choices the city is able to make in, 22 years from now?
So the main financing component that they discussed initially when they unveiled the deal was that they would use what is currently a ballpark fee for paying off the Nationals park bonds, which they're expected to do as soon as 2026, and just extend that fee, which is on businesses that make more than $5 million in the city, and just have them keep paying that, but instead to be invested in RFK Stadium, or whatever the stadium will come to be known as. That was interesting in part because the city had essentially promised businesses that once the ballpark was paid off, that they would stop paying this. And so, they had done that as well with the basketball and hockey arena, saying, oh, yeah, you businesses, we won't have you on the hook for this type of fee in the future. But of course, we see this with Nats Park as well. And now we're going to see it again with RFK. So it essentially is using businesses' revenue in order to fund at least the $500 million portion of the investment related to the actual stadium development. I think there's still a lot of questions for some of the other pieces. One of them, at least, is that a parking garage that'll run about, I want to say, $175 million that DC is going to purchase in 2032. That will involve revenue that comes from the stadium itself.
Has anyone explained why a parking garage costs $175 million?
That's a great question.
Is it made of gold?
I mean, I don't know. That's a really good question.
So because it's DC, and because DC does not have sort of full autonomy, and particularly right now with a big chunk of the city budget waiting for a fix from Congress, that's always going to be part of the deal with these investments in sports. And I had been naively thinking, well, this is a thing that rich franchise owners in the NFL want, and therefore Congress will be only so happy to help them get what they want. But Andy Harris, a Republican of Maryland and author of the famous Harris Rider about legal cannabis in Washington, has explicitly said this is a bad use of funds and not the way DC should be spending its budget. Does that suggest there could be some trouble in the Congress with this deal?
I don't think so. I mean, I think Andy Harris, aside from being a congressman from Maryland, where the state has not been happy with the commander's departure, he's always been a tough critic on the district and its spending. He's not going to help the district with anything. But it was a GOP-led House with, James Comer being the sponsor of this bill. He got a lot of Republicans on board with it. They passed the bill with a lot of Republican support, fully knowing how the NFL and the Commanders really wanted them to get on board too. And they did. So I don't necessarily foresee Congress at this point being like a further impediment, but it's never out of the question, especially at a time when the district's budget, its 25 budget at least, is caught up in Congress. That's sort of opened a Pandora's box, if you will, to Republicans seeing the extent to which they really can impact city finances. And, if they're going to take a closer look at the 2026 budget, you can never put anything out of the question that they might take a closer look or raise questions about how the district spends its money.
Before I let you all go, I mean, far be it from me to agree with Andy Harris, but this is, what he raises, is this a good use of funds, is like the central question, and one that there's very strong opinions on both sides. We had a sports economist on our podcast who said, no, stadiums are a rotten idea if you're talking about doing good things for your local economy. There's plenty of other people who take the other side. Can you just give me sort of a thumbnail view of like, what are the arguments pro and con that responsible people make?
I can just start by saying, like, sort of like the sports economists you had on, I think there's pretty unanimous agreement among them that the case against is that sports stadiums do not deliver the economic investment that they're promised to. That executives in different jurisdictions pay consultants there's a cottage industry of, hey, produce a study that says it will create this X amount of economic benefit, and it doesn't live up to that. The argument for it, I talked to some DC residents, some Commanders fans, and some not Commanders fans for our story last year about the polling, about how people felt about public funding, which it was more split then, and it's gained momentum and popularity since then. But basically people said there's a psychic value to it, to having all the teams in the district, to having a beautiful modern stadium where we can host Taylor Swift or Beyonce, some of these, big acts that people talk about, the World Cup. When a team is in the city, there's real value to that. And I think that the Commanders, I suspect, no one's told me this directly, but I think that they benefited from Monumental almost taking the Capitals and Wizards out of the city, because it forced people to think about, what is DC without our hockey team and our basketball team? What value do we have on that? And are we willing to pay for that? I think that there's no question that there's a cost, but the pro is what you buy, basically.
Phil Mendelson, who's the chairman of the DC Council, has been against public funding for this. He says, look, I think the council is likely going to reach a deal with the Commanders, but the current state of the deal is not bad. Given that, as Sam says, the argument seems to be, when you boil it down and you throw away the kind of hype about we're going to completely revitalize a neighborhood and that sort of stuff, it seems to be prestige versus like the conclusions of sports economists. Is there a magic number that Mendelson or anyone else think that they could get to in order to get them to yes? Or have they said?
They have not said no. Mendelsohn, it's interesting. He has been very, very clear that he opposes any public financing of a stadium. But he has not necessarily specifically said, I'm voting no, or unless you change XYZ, I will vote yes or no. And so I think that really remains to be seen, as this debate gets started, hopefully as soon as this month, when the mayor is expected to finally unveil the budget to the council.
And there's also, just last thing, this sort of factor where, look, we can say talking about sports capital seems sort of like, a slogan that doesn't necessarily mean anything. My sense, and tell me what you think, is that people on the city side, in the city government, or sort of boosters, people who want local Washington to thrive, worry that rejecting this deal would be cast as like, there they go again, that city just is no good for business. And that this is sort of another piece of argument against or in favor of saying yes to this deal. Is that going to be part of the debate? The kind of the DC's sort of broad reputation?
Lawmakers who support the deal say this is an opportunity that DC can't afford to pass up economically. Currently, RFK is a blank slate. It's nothing. It's not bringing in any revenue. So the pro lawmakers are really pushing this as, an economic growth major booster, as well as, part of it's the prestige as well. But that's a huge part of the argument that, even for someone like Wendell Felder, who had been really vague about his position, whether he would support public financing of a stadium throughout his campaign. Now that he's seen the deal, he says he's unequivocally in support. And even though he's the lawmaker who's going to have a lot of the neighbors, some of whom, are in opposition. And how is he going to toe that line? He said his message is that we just can't afford to say no to this opportunity. So I do think that as far as an economic opportunity for those in support, they are going to make the case that the city just shouldn't say no.
So Sam, you mentioned at the top that Washington had lost out on a chance to host the World Cup. More recently, President Trump has announced that Washington is going to host the NFL draft. They were talking about 1 million people coming, which I have very strong doubts about, but all the same, that is seen as sort of a prestige thing to land. What are the next things that listeners ought to look for in terms of things on the calendar, either vis-a-vis the stadium proposal or other big, sports wins the city could get as they try to do this public pivot towards sports?
My colleagues and I are actually working on a story about what events you would attract, looking at the 8 modern stadiums in the NFL that have been built really since 2006. What do they do on the year to year? Because a lot of criticisms of NFL stadiums are, hey, they're used for 10 home games a year and they're dark, unlike, basketball and hockey arenas, which are busy hundreds of nights a year. And basically what I'm finding when you look at SoFi Stadium in Los Angeles or Mercedes-Benz in Atlanta or, comparable venues, really you're talking about 10 ticketed NFL games a year, somewhere between 30 and 40 on the high end of ticketed non-NFL games. And that's soccer, that's Monster Jam, that's family events that people are talking about. And then they almost function like convention centers for private events. In Atlanta, there's a very large religious conference that has 70 or 80,000 people, and it could be down to a high school prom. And there's 100 to 200 smaller private events per year that they're talking about. If you're talking about the big ticket items, I think that you would want to be in contention for some of those larger global events. But when you're talking about if this deal gets done, how is this stadium going to be used? What is it going to look like? I think those are the scale of different events that people would be talking about.
I mean, those things, some of these things are planned. The venues are set way, way, way in advance. And I would imagine that as part of this sort of sales pitch, saying, we've landed the 2030 whatever is a way of trying to make it look like there's momentum. Do we expect other stuff like that coming down the pike in the same vein as the draft?
I think you would have to wait for the stadium to be solidified. I'm not aware of any locked in events like that. And I would be surprised, I think, to, if you're on a Zach Bryan tour or something like that, I don't think that those things are even, locked in for dates at this point anyway.
Hey, Sam, thank you for being here.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me.
Meagan, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And that is all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and maybe subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.